Hi, welcome to our first in a series of 5 for the Lenten series of 2024. This year we're going to be looking at children of the Bible. Now, often they are not recognized. There's a lot of people who think there aren't any, or if they are, they're minimally represented. And while that's true, based on the scriptures that most people hear at church on Sunday, there are actually quite a few children in there, or people who have their childhood rehearsed, as we're going to see today with looking at the patriarchs. And they give us a wider idea of how our tradition has developed, how it's developed out of the Hebrew tradition. Just to clear something up, Christianity did not develop out of Judaism. Judaism and Christianity both developed out of the Hebrew tradition, and I want to keep those lines very, very clean, because there's a concept in Christianity that believes that we are natural inheritors and that anything that's done in the Jewish community we should be doing ourselves, and that's not only thoughtless on our parts as Christians, but it's actually historically not accurate. So we're going to avoid that at all costs. So today we're going to be looking at the patriarchy, and over the the children of the patriarchy rather, or I guess more accurately, the patriarchs as children. Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to be, next week we're going to be looking at the girls of the Hebrew Scriptures. Third week we're going to be looking at boys who became leaders in the Hebrew Scriptures. Our fourth week we'll look at Jesus as a child, which is something that a lot of people don't spend a lot of time thinking about. And then our last Wednesday is going to be looking at other children in the Christian scriptures. So today we're looking at the patriarchs specifically. So that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And all of these patriarchs have problems with their brothers. It's a constant theme throughout, well, Hebrew scriptures anyway. Not so much the Christian scriptures, but Christian scriptures have a different focus than the Hebrew scriptures do, and specifically the book of Genesis. So as we look at the book of Genesis, it is not a history book. Now, often the church has looked at it as a book of history, but it's really not. It is a book of origin. Hence the name Genesis. It gives us our mythology. How is the world created? Why are there so many languages? Does God make a promise to us and keep it? Where did we all come from? Those are the questions that are asked in Genesis. And the first patriarch we encounter, of course, is Abraham. Abraham traveled from the area of Ur in Mesopotamia up over to probably what we consider modern day Syria, Turkey area. And he brought his entourage with him. Well, Abraham had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael was the son of Hagar. Hagar, in the Jewish and Christian traditions, was the slave of Sarah. When she could not have children, she gave her slave to Abraham to have children on her behalf. This is a common story through the patriarchs, as we'll encounter it again. And Hagar did. She had a son named Ishmael. So Isaac finally had his heir. In the Islamic tradition, however, which is interesting, is that they have Hagar as the second wife, and they have Hagar and Sarah actually in agreement, not fighting each other at all. And Hagar was a princess of the house of Egypt, and then along the way she got dropped off, and Ishmael was the patriarch of the Arabs, who would eventually have his own 12 sons who would represent 12 territorial areas in what we understand now as Saudi Arabia. So he had a significant life of his own. If you look at the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, we have the story of Ishmael growing up, as until he was 13, we don't hear much of him past his birth. And at 13, he gets circumcised, along with Abraham and the rest of the folks in Abraham's group. Then at 14, Isaac is born, his brother is born. And according to the Jewish and Christian scriptures, Sarah develops a great deal of jealousy about Hagar, or I guess furthers, because she's already jealous that Hagar had had a child when she didn't. And that further develops, and she gets to resent Ishmael, because Ishmael, by rights, would be the natural inheritor of everything Abraham has. She does not want that for her child. She wants her child to have everything. So she convinces Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Now, Abraham is quite upset about this, has a conversation with God. God assures him that don't worry about it. Just do what Sarah asks. Hagar and Abraham and Ishmael will be taken care of. Great things will happen. Ishmael's going to become this wonderful human being with all sorts of descendants on his own, so don't worry about it. And in the middle of that, Hagar also has had a conversation. Now, Hagar, as the slave of Sarah, really, really hated the way she was being treated. Because she got pregnant, Sarah was even more mean. Now, this is the story that includes her as a slave. So not the one the Muslims have, but the one the Christians and Jews have. And by the way, I should mention that all the Abrahamic traditions recognize all of the patriarchs. So there's different focuses, but it's not like they leave out anybody. They're all recognized communally between the three Abrahamic traditions. So in the Christian and Jewish tradition, Hagar is so upset with the way Sarah is treating her that she runs off into the wilderness because she's trying to run away. And in that time, God tells her to go back and just deal with Sarah, which makes Hagar the second woman to talk to God after Eve. And one of the interesting things we discover as we look at who talks to God, Eve and Hagar and Rebecca talk to God. And yet somehow tradition has dubbed them as the bad girls, the bad women. Interesting, isn't it? Sarah, who hardly says a thing, is considered one of the good people, even though she makes Hagar's life absolutely miserable and eventually kicks her out of their camp. So that is the story of Ishmael and Hagar. Isaac grows up, becomes a teenager, and one of the things that we see is that we don't really have much going on in the childhood of these patriarchs. We have them jumping from their birth or conception straight to teenager and some of the trials they're going to have with that. So we have Isaac, the long-awaited child of Abraham and Sarah, who both laugh. It's not just Sarah who laughed when she heard that she was going to have a child. Abraham did too. So Isaac very legitimately has the name of laughter, which is what Isaac means. And Isaac, unfortunately, is kind of a placeholder. He doesn't have a conversation with God. We talk about him being one of the patriarchs, but really he's just a conduit, really, between his father and his son. He doesn't do anything incredible. He doesn't say anything incredible. He doesn't really even act incredible. In fact, the only thing that is noteworthy about Isaac is that his father almost kills him. And that's a really important part of the Isaac story that we have to kind of pay attention to. Because so many people, especially if they're going to criticize Christianity, one of the first places they're going to go is the story of Isaac and Abraham and the near sacrifice, and how could God ask this of a father to sacrifice his son, especially the only child who has been long awaited. And Abraham just goes about doing what he's supposed to do. It's a very hard story to hear because we're always hearing it with either 20th or 21st century ears. And remember, we have to hear this in the 1st century or perhaps even in the 5th or 6th centuries before the Common Era. What would have been going on at that time? Forensic anthropologists actually can help us with this story. Work has been done on altars found during the Iron Age, so that's around 1200 to 500 BCE. They found altars throughout Iraq and Syria and Saudi Arabia and Israel, maybe even down into Egypt, where they have evidence where children were sacrificed on these altars. Maybe not regularly, but it was not uncommon. So here we have a story where Abraham takes his son to be sacrificed. In that culture, it would have been normal. It would have been just something that had happened. He'd be absolutely devastated, but that's what God asked, so that's what he would do. That was the symbol of loyalty that God asked of him. Other cultures would be doing the same thing, so it was not abnormal. And we really have to remember that, because so many times we want to read these biblical stories in our context, and they don't fit. So we have to go back and look at the context when the story was told and when the story was written down. So the story of Abraham was oral tradition before it got placed in the book that we now understand as the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures. So Isaac is is there, waiting to be sacrificed. Abraham has him there. He's even carried his own logs for the burning of his body. Isaac has. And then God intervenes. And this is the place where theologians and historians and archaeologists kind of come together and say this was symbolic of the culture saying no to child sacrifice, that something else was deemed appropriate. In this case, a ram was found, and that's what Abraham ultimately sacrificed. We're not at the point in history where animal sacrifices are not happening yet. That's centuries away. So animal sacrifices are accepted. I mean, we even see with Mary and Joseph that they did animal sacrifices in the temple. So that was completely understandable in the culture. So why child sacrifices? Why was that a thing? And it was a thing. Around the world, there is no culture that does not have some history of child sacrifices, and some of them even a little bit of cannibalism that went with it. I think the Aztecs actually give us a window on that. When some of the temples in Mexico were being excavated, if you've ever seen Aztec temples, they've got a lot of writing on them. And in reference to child sacrifice, the comment is that we give back to God what is most precious to us, namely our children. And that kind of puts it in context of why child sacrifice was seen as a normal thing, that God would ask the innocent and the vulnerable as a payment. And I'm not talking our God, I'm talking God, however a culture would recognize it, goddess, God, however, would recognize that as the highest honor going. And in some cases it might be provided to stop a drought, or other times it might be put there or done to settle an argument. There can be countless reasons. But the reason potentially the reason children were sacrificed is because we were giving God back the best of ourselves. Intellectually, it makes sense if we remove the children part. It makes sense that we give God back the greatest of ourselves. So when we look at the story of Isaac, we cannot just look at it as this one story, pick it up, put it in our time period, and be disgusted by it. We have to put it back in the Iron Age period and see what was going on around it. But as for Isaac and his childhood, that's pretty well his entire contribution. He didn't really do anything, didn't say anything, didn't talk to God, didn't do anything miraculous that his father and sons were part of. But he had conflict with his brother Ishmael. Now, in their experience, most of that conflict was actually between their mothers, because the Bible tells us there's a 14-year gap between the two of them. So they didn't even have a childhood together. But they're seen as two different entities, both inheritors of the promise of Abraham. And the reason that is significant is because Isaac is the forebearer of Hebrews and ultimately the Jewish people, Christians as well. Ishmael is seen as the patriarch of the Arabs, and Muhammad directly connected his life with the inheritance of Ishmael. So we have two sons of Abraham very much connected to the promises given to Abraham before either of them were even born. That actually underscores so much of the trouble that we have in the Middle East. I remember when I was doing my undergrad way long ago, and there was conflict going on at the time in Israel and Middle East, which, pretty common. And the people in the class insisted that it was all about oil and money. And I broke in. I said, no, it's not. That might be the latest surface issue, but the real issue is Isaac and Ishmael. Even West Wing, if anyone's familiar with that TV show, when 9/11 happened, the West Wing was a very popular political show at the time, and within a month, they inserted this episode called Isaac and Ishmael, where they talked about these two brother traditions who were in conflict because they both had the same promises and they both had the same heritage. They had different lands, perhaps, but none of that was defined, really, when you think about it. So both of them can legitimately claim, Jews and Arabs, Muslims, even Christians, can legitimately claim our heritage in the Holy Lands. in the promised land, it's a hard thing because it's not just Jew against Muslim, it's brother against brother. And if anyone's had an argument with their siblings, you know it's pretty deep, it's pretty long, and it pulls in all of your family history. So that's what the world is looking at right now when we see the conflicts going on in Gaza, is that this is old rivalry, millennia old rivalry. And we have to look back to Isaac and Ishmael to understand better what is going on. So moving on to the next set of brothers, we have Esau and Jacob. And as much as Ishmael and Isaac did not know each other really as brothers, Esau and Jacob were twins. They were both in the womb together, they grew up together, they did everything together. Two very, very different personalities, but they were always together. In fact, they're one of the few sets of twins that we actually have in the Bible. But it's significant because in the heritage of that time, just like Ishmael was supposed to receive all of Abraham's wealth, in the tradition that Esau and Jacob were in, because Esau came out of the womb first, he naturally inherited the bulk of what Abraham had. Now, where that gets really interesting is that Rebekah had a conversation with God, much like Hagar, much like Eve. Isaac does not have a conversation. He prays to God, but there's no response. Except he prays that Rebekah will get pregnant, and that does happen. But God does not talk to Isaac. God does talk to Rebekah. Rebekah is complaining about how these two babies are constantly fighting. She's so uncomfortable. What is going on? And God answers that the younger will be superior to the older, and the older will be subservient to the younger. Exactly the opposite of what the culture of the day would expect and accept for two brothers. Jacob would have gotten his inheritance, but a fraction of what Esau was promised. And God told Rebekah the way it was supposed to be. So here we have a mother, a matriarch, looking at her two babies and knowing what God wanted and knowing it's different from what the culture expects, and she's wearing that for all of these decades until the boys are actually old enough where Isaac is finally about to die and give the blessing to the boys. She carries that, and she raises her sons in that way, and she favors Jacob, the younger one, who will ultimately be the leader that God asked that he would be. Isaac, on the other hand, favors Esau, the older one. He really likes the fact that Esau goes out, hunts, brings him food. The relationship is stronger between those two. Esau is extremely short-sighted. He's all about the now, and we all know people like that. Jacob, on the other hand, has more strategic thinking. He thinks more long-term. Chances are that he has heard or has figured out the promise that Rebekah received. We have no literature to suggest that, but as a mother myself, things just get through. So we have Jacob that potentially knows the role he's supposed to play or has a hint of it. Rebekah favoring him. And then we have the two boys. Esau one day comes in, hunting hasn't worked out, he's starving, and he asks Jacob for some stew. Now, Jacob is the shepherd. Jacob is the one who makes sure the land and the herd is taken care of. He's not as physically large as Esau or as hairy as Esau, as far as the biblical narrative goes. In fact, the name Esau actually means hairy in Hebrew. And he asks for the stew, and Isaac is making a red stew. So red is Edom in Hebrew. So that's how Esau becomes the patriarch of the Edomites, is because of that stew. Very convenient. And I'm going to get back to the way names are happening in a bit. And we have Esau trading in his birthright. He's very much in the now. He's hungry now. Jacob is smart enough to look down the road. So he says, I'll feed you if you promise to trade me my birthright. Esau does. So we do not have a situation, as is commonly rehearsed for us, that Jacob stole all of this. Rebekah and Jacob stole this from Isaac and Esau. Esau gave his birthright, his inheritance, to his brother. He could care less. It wasn't until it was later that he actually had a reaction to it. So Jacob, at this point in time, as a teenager, now has the birthright. I don't know how legally any of this is going to happen, but it's okay. This is all story. It doesn't matter legally. Jacob now has it. Then we fast forward. Bible says they're around 40 when it happened, so they're not actually children anymore. And Isaac is dying, and he tells Esau, go make me some stew, bring it back, and I'll give you my blessing. Well, Rebekah hears that, tells Jacob. They get together. Jacob puts animal hide on his arms so that his father can feel, and somehow he's convinced that this is Esau. He eats the stew, and then he gives the blessing to Jacob. Esau comes back, does his thing, comes into his father, and Isaac's like, who are you? Now, Isaac has gone blind, so he's got only touch to understand who is the son. And this sets up a huge conflict between Esau and Jacob. If they hadn't already been at odds, this does it. This pushes him over. And Esau threatens to kill Jacob. So Rebekah, again, goes to tell Jacob, and he takes off. But this is the younger years of Jacob and Esau. Much like Ishmael, Esau at this point in time really fades out. We hear about the descendants, we hear about the good things that happen, but they don't have the story. In the situation of Jacob and Esau, Jacob's story will continue, as we're quite common with. But as children, they show two different sides of the Hebrew promises, of the division of the patriarchs. They also show how God is intervening, and none of the things now. Isaac being killed on the altar, Jacob getting the birthright, these are not things that are societally accepted or common. So we have God intervening in both the lives of Isaac and Jacob to put us on a different path than culture would demand. So that's those two brothers. And then we have the third set of brothers. We have Joseph, and he's got 10 brothers, and a baby one will eventually join them. But he's got 10 brothers who are born to people who are not his father's favorite wife. Now, favoritism is a theme throughout all of this. All of these men, well, Abraham has daughters, Isaac does not, Jacob does have daughters. We don't hear much about them, but they do exist. But it's brothers, particularly, where the story is. And Joseph is the favorite. He is the first child of the favorite wife, long-awaited child. And the brothers really resent him. And Joseph has no tact. He will tell his brothers and his father and mother about the dreams he had, where they bow down to him. And Jacob kind of pushes back on him a little bit and says, what, we're supposed to be below you? But he doesn't actually censor Joseph. In fact, if anything, he just continues to shower gifts on Joseph. And he gives him eventually a cloak that not only symbolizes within the family that he is the favorite, while all the other brothers have to go out and work, but it symbolizes to the rest of the world, the rest of their community, that Joseph is the privileged child. Now, if Ishmael and Isaac had conflict over inheritance rights, and Esau and Jacob had conflict over inheritance rights, and they were just the second sons, how about the 11th son? It's not going to be acceptable to the oldest. Actually, I think two of the sons are born after Joseph, but they exist, and they're out in the field, and they are doing their thing, doing the work that Joseph is never asked to do. In fact, I'm not sure if it's in Scripture or it's in another place where Joseph's actually the one given an education. So he's the one that can read and write better, do math better than anybody else in the family. That's got to build up resentment, and it does. And so when he is a teenager, when he's 17, his father has given him this gorgeous cloak and goes out and he tells him to go out and get the brothers out of the field. So Joseph goes. And he's a braggart. I mean, this guy has no common sense. He's not reading the room at all. And he brags to his brothers about his cloak, about his dreams, about his power, about his education, about everything that he has that they, quite frankly, don't have or don't have to the same extent. And the brothers decide to kill him. Now, It is moderated when a bunch of travelers come by, peddlers come by, and they decide, no, we won't kill him, we'll just sell him into slavery. And then, of course, they mark up the coat, take it back to Joseph, said he was killed, or yeah, Jacob rather, say he was killed, and it's the biggest upset that Joseph has had since the death of Rachel. So we have this horrible, horrible experience for Jacob now. His favorite son is gone. Joseph, meanwhile, is taken to Israel, or Egypt rather, where he eventually will rise in power because his education is seen by Potiphar and the others who are in the Egyptian hierarchy. And eventually, Joseph's story will lead us to Moses' story. But the patriarchs themselves are setting up the whole narrative about how important the nation of Israel is, how important the chosen people are, where their land of privilege is, their promised land. The patriarchs and the matriarchs, which are not recognized particularly in Islamic or Christian traditions, but they really are within the Jewish tradition. The 7 of them are actually honored at the same time. The patriarchs and matriarchs set up the atmosphere, the world where we're now going to understand the Hebrew people and all the oppression that they are going to continue to experience as we proceed through the Hebrew scriptures and eventually into the Christian scriptures. Now, one of the things when we're reading Genesis and why we cannot read this as history is because we have too much narrative about these people. Their names are given to their personalities and defined as hairy in one, in the case of Esau, adding on in the case of Joseph. They all have symbolic names. Now, I've named children. Many of you have named children as well. We are not aware when they are a day old who they're going to be. There is no way we have that level of insight. When we look at the matriarchs and patriarchs, it is narrative history. It is not verifiable history. It is the history of a culture, but not necessarily something we can read in a history book, partially because there is no literature old enough that can actually back this up. We have a stele in Egypt around 1315 BCE that references the Israeli people, but we've got nothing that actually talks about who they were, where they were, what they did. So when we're looking back at Genesis, we're looking at almost fanciful stories that fanciful suggests that it's illegitimate and we shouldn't pay attention to it, but we should, because literary history matters. But if we're looking at this for accountability history, we're going to fail. I mean, first of all, there's no way anyone's getting to 99 and 100. That just is not going to happen, even though most of them, if they had lived long enough, will have the same lifespan as ours. When you look at the lifespan of ancient peoples, it's skewed by infant mortality. But if you live through that, you live the regular life, the majority of us in modernity actually experience. But if you look at the narrative, if you look at how the story is told, there is incredible symbolism. The names are symbolic. The locations are symbolic. The actions are symbolic. All of it is setting up the culture of the Hebrew tradition. At the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we're talking about nomadic peoples. It's not until we get to Joseph that we start to see them coalesce into a cultural group. They aren't even a religious group at this point in time. They're a cultural group. But they're nomadic first. And that's who the patriarchs give us, a people who are moving all around, a people who are not gathered. They're inheritors who pick up different people as they go along. What they have in common is that they have a promise from God that this land that they're walking through, all of it, is ultimately going to be the land where their descendants live. The patriarchs and the matriarchs are shared by all 3 Abrahamic traditions. None of us get sole claim to it. They're part of who we are, and they set the stage for what will come next as we look at more children and eventually as you read more about other characters in the Bible. So thank you this week for coming to our first study in this Lenten season. We'll proceed now for the next 4 weeks, looking at different children in the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures, and hopefully it'll give a fuller understanding of how God relates to us in our childlike state, because Jesus tells us that God likes us to be children, not as infantile and unknowledgeable, but open hearts and willingness to accept. So enjoy your day, and I hope your Lenten season is going to continue to be reflective and helpful and meaningful for everything you do.